July 29th, 1944. Roncey, France. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann pressed himself deeper into the ditch as the sky erupted with sound. The distinctive rumble of American radial engines grew louder, deeper, more threatening with each passing second. Around him, what remained of his Panzer company, once 23 tanks strong, lay scattered across 3 kilometers of Norman hedgerow country like broken toys. Hartmann had commanded Panzer Mark IVs with the 2nd SS Das Reich Panzer Division for 18 months. He had fought at Kursk. He had survived the grinding retreat across Ukraine. He understood combat. He understood fear. But what he witnessed that afternoon between Roncey and Saint-Denis-le-Vetu was something altogether different. It was extermination. The first wave came in low, maybe 300 meters, their wings bristling with underwing ordnance that looked like steel pipes attached to launch rails. Hartmann recognized the silhouette Republic, P-47 Thunderbolts, the massive American fighter everyone called the Jug. His men called them something else. Jabos, fighter bombers, the terror from above. Through a gap in the hedgerow, he watched the lead aircraft roll into its attack dive, nose pointing earthward at 45 degrees. Smoke trails erupted from beneath its wings. Not one, not two. 8 separate rocket motors ignited simultaneously, sending high-velocity aircraft rockets 5-inch diameter weapons the Americans nicknamed Holy Moses, streaking toward a Panther tank, attempting to maneuver through an opening in the stone wall ahead. The first rocket struck the turret side at nearly 1,400 feet per second. The shaped charge warhead, carrying 7.5 pounds of Composition B explosive, detonated on contact. The copper cone inside the warhead collapsed, focusing explosive force into a superheated jet of metal plasma that burned through armor plate like a cutting torch through paper. The Panther's 70mm side armor, sufficient to stop most anti-tank rounds at combat range, offered no meaningful resistance. The jet penetrated deep into the fighting compartment, igniting ammunition stored in racks beside the turret ring. 3 more rockets impacted within 2 seconds. The Panther exploded from within, its turret lifting off the hull like a grotesque jack-in-the-box, somersaulting through the air trailing smoke and flame before crashing back to Earth 15 meters away. But the Thunderbolts were not finished. Behind the first aircraft came a second, then a third, then a fourth, 12 in formation, each carrying identical ordnance loads. When rockets were expended, they switched to their primary armament, 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hartmann watched the gun. Barrels wink orange flame as a 3-second burst put 23 pounds of projectiles into a half-track, attempting to reverse into cover. 75 2-ounce slugs, armor-piercing incendiary rounds travelling at 2,800 feet per second, tore through the vehicle's thin armor plating, shredding crew, engine, and fuel tanks into burning wreckage within heartbeats. The recoil from 8 guns firing together was so pronounced that pilots reported their aircraft slowing 20 to 30 miles per hour during extended bursts. This was not precision shooting. This was overwhelming firepower delivered with industrial efficiency. By nightfall, when American ground forces from the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions finally pushed through to assess the carnage, their intelligence officers counted carefully. 66 tanks destroyed, 204 other vehicles obliterated, 11 artillery pieces blown apart, all within a 6-hour period, all from air attack alone. The 5th Fighter Group, flying P-47s, had maintained continuous strikes from 3 to 10 in the afternoon until 9:40 in the evening, wave after wave, turning 3 kilometers of French countryside into what German survivors would call the Hölle von Roncey, the Hell of Roncey. Hartmann survived, somehow. When darkness finally came and the Thunderbolts departed to refuel and rearm, he crawled from his ditch and began walking east, leaving his destroyed Panzer company behind. He would never forget the sound of those engines, the deep, throbbing power of 18-cylinder radials pushing aircraft weighing over 6 tons through attack dives that should have torn lighter fighters apart. and he would never forget the casual efficiency with which American pilots destroyed German armor that had taken months to build, transport, and crew, eliminating it in seconds with weapons German ground forces could only dream of possessing. What Hartmann could not have known that evening was that his experience represented not an isolated incident, but rather a new reality of industrialized warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially designed as a high-altitude interceptor to protect bomber formations, had evolved into something far more dangerous, a ground attack weapon system that combined devastating firepower, remarkable durability, and overwhelming numerical superiority into a combination German forces had no effective counter for. The story of how Wehrmacht troops came to fear the Thunderbolt more than any other Allied aircraft begins not with combat but with engineering, with choices made in American design offices that prioritized pilot survival and versatility over narrow performance optimization, with a philosophy that accepted weight and complexity in exchange for capabilities that could be adapted to missions never envisioned when the aircraft first flew. 3 years before Hartmann cowered in that Norman ditch, Republic aviation engineers in Farmingdale, New York, had created an aircraft that would fundamentally alter the balance of power on Western European battlefields, not through technological breakthroughs, not through revolutionary innovation, but through the systematic application of American industrial might to the problem of destroying enemy ground forces from the air. The Thunderbolt's path to dominance began with a seemingly insurmountable problem. In 1940, as German armies swept across France, American aviation planners confronted uncomfortable reality. Their existing fighter designs were inadequate. The Curtiss P-40 performed well enough at medium altitudes, but lacked the performance needed to escort bombers at 25,000 feet, where German interceptors operated effectively. The Bell P-39 carried impressive cannon armament, but suffered altitude limitations that made it unsuitable for European combat. What the Army Air Corps desperately needed was a fighter capable of operating at extreme altitude while carrying sufficient firepower to protect bomber formations and enough structural strength to absorb battle damage. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, approached the problem with characteristic pragmatism. Rather than pursuing elegant efficiency, he designed around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. But high-altitude performance required more than raw engine power. It demanded maintaining that power in thin air at 30,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure dropped to barely 1/3 of sea-level density. German engineers had attempted various solutions with limited success. Kartveli chose a different approach entirely. He specified a General Electric turbo supercharger driven by exhaust gases that would force compressed air into the engine's cylinders regardless of altitude. The turbo supercharger decision shaped everything else about the aircraft's design. The turbine unit, mounted in the rear fuselage, required extensive ducting to route exhaust gases backward from the engine, then route compressed intake air forward through an intercooler and back into the carburetor. This necessitated a fuselage large enough to accommodate complex plumbing, creating an aircraft substantially bigger than contemporary fighters. The engine itself, that massive radial power plant, required substantial frontal area, further increasing size and weight. Kartveli accepted these compromises because they enabled the capabilities military planners demanded. The first prototype, designated XP-47, rolled out in early 1941. It was enormous for a single-seat fighter. Empty weight approached 10,000 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight exceeded 13,000 pounds. By comparison, the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 weighed 5,900 pounds empty, 7,500 pounds at combat weight. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's most advanced production fighter, weighed approximately 7,650 pounds empty. The Thunderbolt was genuinely massive, larger than some twin-engine aircraft in service with various air forces. Pilots joked that it was so big a pilot could run around inside the fuselage to escape enemy fire. German pilots, upon first encountering them in combat, assumed the size indicated inferior performance. They were catastrophically wrong. On May 6, 1941, test pilot Lowry Brabham lifted the P-47 off the runway at Republic's Farmingdale facility for the aircraft's maiden flight. The evaluation program revealed both impressive capabilities and concerning limitations. The massive radial engine provided abundant power. The structural design was robust, capable of withstanding high G-loads and battle damage. The 850 caliber machine guns delivered formidable firepower. But early testing also revealed limitations that would have disqualified lesser designs. The aircraft was heavy and relatively slow to accelerate. Rate of climb at low altitude was mediocre. Turning performance at medium altitudes could not match nimbler German fighters. Yet, at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the turbo-supercharger's advantages became manifest, the Thunderbolt transformed completely. The turbo-supercharger maintained full-rated engine power at altitudes where German fighters gasped for oxygen and lost performance dramatically. At 25,000 feet, the R-2800 still produced 2,000 horsepower, while the BMW 801 radial powering the Focke-Wulf 190 managed perhaps 70% of its sea-level output. This translated directly into performance advantage where it mattered most at the altitudes where American heavy bombers operated and where German interceptors had to climb to attack them. The P-47 at 30,000 feet could accelerate, climb, and maneuver with authority, while German fighters struggled simply to maintain altitude. The turbo-supercharger turned altitude itself into a weapon. Production began in earnest in late 1942. Republic's Farmingdale facility ramped up manufacturing, initially producing a handful of aircraft monthly, then dozens, eventually exceeding 60 per month at peak output. Curtiss Wright's Buffalo plant added additional production capacity, bringing combined output to over 100 aircraft monthly by mid-1944. These were not hand-built custom fighters assembled by artisans. They were mass-produced military hardware built on assembly lines by workers who had never built aircraft before the war began. Yet quality remained consistently high. Every component met specifications, every system functioned reliably. American industry had learned to produce complex machines at scale, while maintaining precision that German factories increasingly struggled to match as strategic bombing degraded their manufacturing capacity. The first P-47s arrived in England in late 1942, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group. Initial operational deployment focused on the aircraft's original design mission high-altitude bomber escort. On April 8, 1943, P-47s flew their first combat mission over occupied Europe, escorting B-17 flying fortresses attacking targets in the Netherlands. German fighter pilots, accustomed to intercepting unescorted or poorly escorted bomber formations, now faced determined fighter opposition at altitudes where they had previously operated with impunity. Luftwaffe combat reports from these early encounters reflected confusion and frustration. The American fighters seemed impossibly large and heavy, yet they matched or exceeded German fighter performance at high altitude. Their diving speed was extraordinary. German pilots attempting to plaze, escape by diving found Thunderbolts overtaking them easily. But the characteristic that most impressed German pilots and most frustrated German tactical doctrine was durability. Luftwaffe fighters were optimized for performance, lightweight structures built to minimum specifications, accepting vulnerability in exchange for speed and maneuverability. The Americans had made different choices. The P-47's massive radial engine provided natural armor, shielding the pilot from frontal attack. Heavy armor plates surrounded the cockpit, creating what designers called an armored bathtub that protected against machine gun fire and shrapnel. Redundant systems meant single battle damage rarely proved fatal, and the distributed structure meant the aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters and continue flying. German pilots reported shooting Thunderbolts repeatedly, seeing their cannon shells explode against the American fighter's airframe, watching pieces tear away, and then watching in disbelief as the damaged aircraft dove away at speeds no German fighter could match, limping back to England with battle damage that should have been unsurvivable. These early combat experiences established a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. Individual German pilots might achieve tactical success through superior positioning or pilot skill, but strategically, the Thunderbolt represented advantages German forces could not overcome. The Americans built them faster than Germany could destroy them. They operated at altitudes where German fighters performed poorly. They survived battle damage that killed German pilots. And increasingly, they carried pilots trained to professional standards that German training programs could no longer match as fuel shortages and time pressures compressed instruction. By early 1944, P-47s had established air superiority over occupied Europe during daylight hours. German fighters still contested control, but they did so from an increasingly disadvantageous position. American bomber formations penetrated German airspace with heavy fighter escort. Luftwaffe interceptors attempting to attack bombers had to fight through escort fighters that held both positional and performance advantages. The attrition mathematics were unsustainable for Germany. Every experienced German pilot lost was nearly irreplaceable. Every American pilot lost was replaced within weeks by graduates from training programs that provided 250 hours of instruction before pilots joined operational units. But the P-47's evolution from interceptor to ground attack aircraft began not from high-level strategy, but from tactical experimentation by aggressive commanders looking for ways to employ their fighters more effectively. Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group pioneered low-level strafing missions in early 1944, personally leading attacks on German airfields, trains, and vehicle convoys. Duncan's philosophy was simple. The Thunderbolt's massive engine and heavy construction made it extraordinarily survivable at low altitude where lighter fighters were vulnerable. Its 8 machine guns delivered devastating firepower against ground targets. Why restrict such capability to high-altitude escort when German forces needed transportation, supplies, and reinforcements that moved on roads and rail lines that could be attacked directly? Initial ground attack missions revealed promising characteristics. The radial engine, air-cooled rather than liquid-cooled, could sustain significant battle damage without immediately failing. An inline engine struck by ground fire that ruptured coolant lines would overheat within minutes, forcing pilots to bail out or attempt emergency landings. A radial engine with damaged cylinders simply ran on its remaining cylinders, often producing enough power to get the pilot home. The aircraft's size, initially perceived as a liability, provided space for ordnance racks under the wings and fuselage. Early P-47D models carried a single 500-pound bomb under the fuselage centerline. Later variants added underwing racks for additional bombs or, critically, rockets. The rocket armament would transform the P-47 from effective ground attack aircraft into the tank killer Wehrmacht troops learned to fear above all else. Development of the high-velocity aircraft rocket proceeded in parallel with the Thunderbolt's operational deployment, driven by Navy requirements for weapons capable of attacking hardened targets from aircraft. The HVAR design team at Caltech in California approached the project with characteristic American pragmatism. They needed a rocket that flew fast enough to maintain accuracy, carried sufficient explosive power to damage hardened targets, and could be manufactured in quantity. The solution was elegant, a 5-inch diameter rocket throughout its entire length, using a powerful ballistite propellant that burned hot and fast, pushing the rocket to over 1,400 feet per second at motor burnout. The warhead options reflected versatility. General-purpose warheads with 7.5 pounds of TNT served against most targets. Armor-piercing shaped charge warheads, using a copper cone to focus explosive force, could penetrate reinforced concrete and armor plate. White phosphorus warheads provided incendiary effects, but the shaped charge variant proved most significant for ground attack missions. Tests demonstrated that HVAR could penetrate 4 feet of reinforced concrete. Against armor plate, the shaped charge jet created by the collapsing copper cone could defeat armor thickness that stopped most anti-tank weapons organic to ground forces. Development progressed rapidly, compressed by wartime urgency. By June 6, 1944 D-Day, HVARs were ready for operational deployment. Navy stocks were airlifted to 9th Air Force fighter squadrons in England, where ground crews worked through the night installing launch rails under P-47 wings. Each Thunderbolt could carry 10 5-inch rockets, 5 under each wing, plus full gun ammunition. This combination of rockets for armoured targets, bombs for area targets, and guns for everything else created a weapons system of unprecedented versatility. A single P-47 could attack a tank column with rockets, strafe supporting infantry with machine guns, drop bombs on defensive positions, and still possess adequate fuel to return to base. No other aircraft in any air force combined this level of multi-role capability with the durability needed to survive sustained low-altitude operations. The initial combat employment of rocket-armed P-47s occurred during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. After weeks of grinding combat in the Bocage hedgerow country, American ground forces needed air power to blast gaps in German defensive lines that ground forces could exploit. The plan called for massive aerial bombardment, followed immediately by armoured spearheads pushing through the gaps before German forces could recover. P-47s from multiple fighter groups would provide close air support, attacking German armour and defensive positions identified by ground controllers. The first large-scale demonstration of rocket-armed Thunderbolts destroying German armour occurred on July 29 at Roncey, where Oberleutnant Hartmann experienced the attack that opened this story. But Roncey represented merely one engagement among hundreds that summer. From D-Day through the end of August 1944, P-47 squadrons flew relentless ground attack missions across northern France. Official claims, documented through gun camera footage and verified by ground forces advancing across the battlefield, totaled 86,000 railroad cars destroyed or damaged, 9,000 locomotives rendered inoperable, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks eliminated. These numbers, while inevitably including some duplication and overclaiming typical in combat assessments, represented genuine strategic impact. Wehrmacht logistics collapsed under sustained air attack. German ground forces attempting to move reinforcements or supplies during daylight faced certain attack within minutes of detection. Train movements that normally moved battalions quickly to threatened sectors instead crawled through the night, hiding in tunnels and forests during the day, arriving late and piecemeal if they arrived at all. Armoured formations attempting tactical manoeuvres found themselves unable to concentrate forces without immediately attracting fighter-bomber strikes that destroyed vehicles faster than factories could replace them. The German term Jabo-Jagd fighter-bomber hunt entered common vocabulary among frontline troops who spent as much time scanning the skies for attacking aircraft as they did watching for enemy ground forces. German soldiers who survived the Normandy campaign carried memories of helplessness that shaped their understanding of modern warfare. Gefreiter Hans Becker, a Wehrmacht infantryman with the 352nd Infantry Division, recorded his experience in a letter that Allied intelligence officers recovered after his capture in August 1944. "We dug foxholes along the hedgerow and waited for the Amis to attack. The artillery preparation began at dawn, methodical, devastating, walking across our positions with clockwork precision. When it lifted, we expected the infantry assault. Instead came the Jabos." Becker described watching from his foxhole as a formation of 12 P-47s approached at low altitude, their wings laden with ordnance. They came in line, one after another, each pilot taking his time. Aircraft dove on a Panzer Mark IV, positioned behind the stone wall 200 meters from my position. I watched rockets leave the wings. They looked like telegraph poles with fire shooting from their rear ends. The first rocket missed, striking the wall in an explosion of stone fragments. The second hit the turret directly. The tank simply came apart. The turret lifted off, and the hull burst into flames. What made the experience particularly harrowing for German ground forces was the methodical nature of the attacks. Unlike artillery bombardment, which saturated areas with explosive but often failed to destroy hardened targets, the Thunderbolt attacks were surgical. Pilots identified specific targets, a tank, a half-track, a self-propelled gun, and prosecuted attacks until that target was destroyed, then moved to the next. Becker continued, "After the first aircraft expended its rockets, it strafed our foxholes with machine guns. The sound was unlike anything I had experienced. Not the sharp crack of rifle fire, but a deep, ripping roar like heavy canvas being torn. Earth erupted around my position. Then the second aircraft made its attack pass, then the third. This continued for what felt like hours, but was perhaps 20 minutes. When they finally departed, our company no longer existed as a fighting force." The psychological impact of sustained air attack compounded the physical destruction. German soldiers developed what medical officers recognized as combat fatigue, specifically associated with air attack, an acute anxiety condition triggered by the sound of aircraft engines, particularly the distinctive rumble of American radial engines. Soldiers who had endured Soviet artillery bombardments on the Eastern Front, who had survived close-quarters urban combat in Stalingrad, who had experienced the most intense conventional warfare possible, reported that sustained fighter-bomber attack was qualitatively different. Artillery could be survived through proper digging and dispersion. Enemy infantry could be fought with weapons and tactics German soldiers understood. But aircraft attacking from above with weapons, German ground forces had no effective counter for created helplessness that eroded unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness in ways traditional combat did not. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuver warfare, rapid movement of armored and mechanized forces to concentrate combat power at decisive points. This doctrine had delivered stunning victories during the early war years when German forces possessed air superiority or faced opponents without effective tactical air power. But in Normandy, during the summer of 1944, German ground forces discovered their tactical doctrine was obsolete. Movement during daylight invited immediate air attack. Concentrating forces created lucrative targets for fighter bombers. Attempting to reinforce threatened sectors resulted in convoys destroyed en route. German commanders faced impossible choices: remain dispersed and accept piecemeal defeat, or concentrate forces and accept annihilation from the air. The German response evolved through several phases, each reflecting growing understanding of the threat and growing desperation to counter it. Initial orders emphasized camouflage and concealment. Units moving by road were instructed to maintain wide spacing between vehicles, to avoid parking near buildings that provided aiming references for pilots, and to have all personnel exit vehicles and seek cover immediately upon spotting aircraft. These measures reduced losses marginally, but could not eliminate the fundamental vulnerability. An experienced Thunderbolt pilot could spot a convoy despite camouflage, and once spotted, the convoy faced sustained attack until destroyed or darkness provided escape. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide air cover for German ground forces but lacked the aircraft, pilots, and fuel necessary for sustained operations. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe fighter strength in the West had declined to perhaps 300 serviceable aircraft facing Allied air forces fielding thousands. German pilots were brave, often skilled, but outnumbered 10 or 20 to 1 on any given day. A few German fighters might briefly contest Allied air superiority over a specific area, but they would inevitably be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The sky belonged to the Allies during daylight hours. German ground forces understood this with absolute clarity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Anti-aircraft defenses provided the most effective counter to low-altitude air attack, but German flak units faced their own resource constraints. The formidable 88mm flak guns that had proven deadly to Allied bombers at high altitude were too heavy and immobile for frontline deployment with mobile ground forces. Lighter weapons, 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons mounted on half-tracks, provided some protection, but required skilled crews, ammunition that grew increasingly scarce, and positioning that anticipated where attacks would occur. Thunderbolt pilots learned to identify and prioritize flak positions, attacking them with rockets and bombs before engaging other targets. Many missions specifically tasked flights to suppress anti-aircraft defenses so subsequent waves could attack with reduced risk. The introduction of the 37mm flak 43 represented Germany's most effective mobile anti-aircraft system. This weapon, mounted on an SDK-FZ-7, 2 half-track, combined rapid-fire rate, effective range, and sufficient armor penetration to threaten even the rugged Thunderbolt. The flak 43 could fire 120 rounds per minute of high-explosive ammunition to an effective ceiling of 4,800 meters. Against aircraft attacking at low altitude, it was lethal. But by late 1944, Germany possessed perhaps 200 flak 43 systems across all fronts. This was grossly insufficient to protect the hundreds of convoys, formations, and facilities requiring defense. German industry attempted to increase flak production, but the same strategic bombing that made anti-aircraft defense essential also degraded the manufacturing capacity needed to produce anti-aircraft weapons. Factories producing flak systems required precision machinery, skilled workers, electricity, steel, and time. Allied bombing systematically destroyed precision machinery, killed or scattered skilled workers, disrupted electricity supply, interdicted steel shipments, and eliminated the time needed for systematic production by forcing constant emergency repairs and production relocations. German flak production in 1944 totaled approximately 35% of planned output. The weapons existed on paper, in procurement plans and production schedules. They did not exist on the battlefield where they were desperately needed. Wehrmacht ground forces adapted tactically through bitter experience. Units learned to move only at night or during periods of low visibility when weather-grounded Allied aircraft. A journey that required 4 hours in daylight might take 3 nights to complete moving under blackout conditions on secondary roads while constantly halting to avoid detection. Armoured vehicles were parked under trees during daylight, covered with camouflage nets draped with foliage, dispersed widely to avoid presenting concentrated targets. Repair work, refueling, ammunition distribution, all the logistical activities that sustain combat units occurred during darkness. German soldiers became nocturnal, sleeping in concealment during the day, active only when darkness provided sanctuary. But tactical adaptation could not overcome strategic reality. Night movement was slow. Fuel consumed during 3 nights of cautious driving might move a unit a distance achievable in 4 hours of daylight travel. The constant delays meant German reinforcements arrived piecemeal, too late to influence the battles they were intended to support. When the American Third Army under General George Patton broke out of Normandy in early August and began its rapid advance across France, German forces, attempting to respond, found themselves unable to concentrate sufficient strength to establish coherent defensive lines. Units would receive orders to move to defensive positions, spend 2 or 3 nights reaching their assigned sector, and discover American forces had already advanced beyond that position, requiring further movement to catch up to a front that moved faster than German forces could respond. The human cost of sustained air attack extended beyond casualties directly caused by rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. German logistics units attempting to supply frontline forces faced impossible challenges. A supply convoy departing a depot carrying food, ammunition, and fuel might require 5 nights to reach its destination, assuming it reached the destination at all. Vehicles that broke down could not be recovered during daylight without inviting attack. The mechanics needed to repair vehicles were themselves vulnerable to air attack. Fuel consumed during the slow nighttime movement reduced the amount delivered to the units needing fuel. The mathematics of logistics broke down completely. Oberst Werner Kortenhaus, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, documented this reality in his after-action report following the Normandy campaign. The division received orders to move from the Caen sector to support operations near Mortagne. The road distance was approximately 80 kilometers. Under normal conditions, this movement would require perhaps 5 hours. We began movement on August 7th. Fighter-bomber attacks destroyed 17 vehicles on the first night. We dispersed remaining forces more widely. On August 8th, daylight attacks destroyed another 23 vehicles despite maximum dispersion and camouflage. On August 9th, we abandoned daylight movement entirely. The division reached Mortain on August 12th, 5 days after receiving movement orders. By this time, the operation we were intended to support had already failed. Division strength had been reduced by approximately 30% before engaging American ground forces. The Mortain offensive represented Germany's last significant counterattack in the West and demonstrated conclusively that Wehrmacht operational doctrine was no longer viable against opponents possessing air supremacy. Hitler had ordered the attack despite objections from field commanders who understood the futility of offensive operations under Allied air supremacy. The plan called for concentrated Panzer forces to drive west toward Avranches, splitting the American advance and potentially trapping Patton's forces in Brittany. On paper, the concept was sound classic blitzkrieg doctrine executed by experienced panzer divisions. In reality, the attack was slaughtered from the air. The 4 panzer divisions committed to the offensive assembled their forces during the night of August 6th, planning to launch the attack at dawn before Allied aircraft could intervene. But the assembly was detected through intelligence intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. As dawn broke on August 7th, American fighter-bombers were already orbiting above the battlefield, waiting for sufficient light to identify targets. General Lieutenant Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, later described what followed. Our attack made initial progress in the pre-dawn darkness. By 0800 hours, we had advanced approximately 5 kilometers against limited resistance. Then Allied fighter-bombers arrived. For the next 6 hours, my division was subjected to continuous air attack of an intensity I had never experienced. Attacks came in waves of 12 to 16 aircraft, one wave arriving as the previous wave departed to refuel and rearm. P-47s from the 9th Air Force's fighter-bomber groups flew over 400 sorties against the Mortain salient on August 7th alone. Pilots reported attacking in target-rich environments where German vehicles and tanks crowded the roads, unable to disperse due to terrain constraints. The combination of rockets against armoured vehicles and machine gun fire against everything else proved devastating. One pilot from the 365th Fighter Group, the Hellhawks, described his squadron's attack. We spotted approximately 15 Panzers in a wooded area attempting to conceal themselves under the trees. We could see the camouflage netting but also the track marks in the dirt showing where they had positioned. I rolled, and in with my wingman, fired 2 pairs of HVARs. My first pair struck near the lead tank, the second pair impacted the tank directly. Massive secondary explosion, the ammunition cooked off. The tanks behind attempted to maneuver, but we were on them. Our entire squadron made multiple passes. When we departed for fuel, at least 8 Panzers were burning. The 3-day Battle of Mortain cost German forces approximately 120 tanks destroyed, over 200 other armoured vehicles eliminated, and perhaps 15,000 casualties, including soldiers simply abandoning their positions and retreating without orders. The offensive gained no meaningful ground and exhausted Germany's armour reserves in the west. Perhaps more significantly, it demonstrated to German commanders that offensive operations were no longer possible under Allied air supremacy. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, refined through years of successful campaigns, had become obsolete. Across France during August 1944, P-47 squadrons maintained relentless pursuit. The withdrawal became a running massacre. German columns retreating by road were attacked repeatedly throughout each daylight period. Vehicles that broke down were abandoned. Units that attempted to establish temporary defensive positions were bypassed by advancing American ground forces and destroyed from the air. The Seine River crossings became particularly deadly. German engineers had destroyed bridges during their retreat, forcing retreating units to use ferry crossings and temporary bridges that became bottleneck targets. On August 19th, P-47s from the 9th Air Force attacked German forces attempting to cross the Seine near Elbeuf. Over 200 vehicles were crowded on both banks, waiting to cross on improvised ferries. The attacks continued throughout the day, with fresh squadrons arriving as earlier squadrons departed for fuel. By nightfall, Allied intelligence estimated over 1,500 vehicles destroyed in what German survivors called Jabos fighter-bomber terror. Individual P-47 pilots accumulated destruction tallies that seemed almost impossible. Captain William Colgan, flying with the 371st Fighter Squadron, discovered a 30-mile-long German convoy attempting to retreat up the Rhône River Valley in southern France on August 28th. The convoy was packed with vehicles moving 2 and 3 abreast, retreating north following the Allied landings in southern France. Colgan called in his entire squadron. For the next 4 hours, they systematically attacked the convoy with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. Post-mission reconnaissance photographs showed over 700 vehicles destroyed or abandoned along that 30-mile stretch of road. These were not exaggerations or propaganda claims. Allied ground forces advancing across the same terrain photographed, and Cleese catalogued the destruction. Roads were literally blocked by destroyed vehicles that had to be bulldozed into ditches to allow Allied traffic through. The scale of destruction visible in contemporary photographs exceeded anything seen in previous campaigns. Entire German divisions essentially ceased to exist as organized fighting forces, not from defeat in ground combat, but from annihilation by air attack during retreat. The effectiveness of the P-47 in this role stemmed from multiple factors working synergistically. The aircraft's durability meant pilots could press attacks despite ground fire. The radial engine absorbed damage that would down lighter fighters. Multiple pilots returned to base with significant battle damage, cylinders shot away, control surfaces torn, fuel tanks holed, yet the aircraft continued flying. This durability enabled aggressive tactics. Pilots could make low-altitude strafing passes, diving to treetop level to attack with maximum accuracy, accepting the increased exposure to ground fire because they understood their aircraft could survive hits that would kill them in more fragile fighters. The weapons load provided versatility unmatched by any other single-engine aircraft in any air force. 10 HVARs could destroy 10 armored vehicles if every rocket hit, and while pilots rarely achieved perfect accuracy, multiple rockets per target ensured high kill probability. After rockets were expended, 8 50-caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds, total ammunition could strafe for 30 seconds of sustained fire, or more typically, could engage 20 to 30 different targets with burst fire. Then bombs 500 to 1,000 pounds carried under wings or fuselage provided punch against larger targets or area targets like troop concentrations. But perhaps most important was numerical superiority. The 9th Air Force alone operated over 40 P-47 groups by summer 1944, with each group fielding approximately 75 aircraft. This represented nearly 3,000 Thunderbolts dedicated to ground attack missions, with additional hundreds assigned to the 8th Air Force for long-range escort duties. German ground forces attempting to move or maneuver faced the near certainty of air attack within minutes of detection. The Americans could maintain continuous presence over the battlefield through rotation as one squadron returned to base for fuel and ammunition, another arrived overhead. German soldiers described the sky as always containing the distinctive silhouette of Thunderbolts circling at medium altitude, waiting to be called down to attack targets identified by ground controllers or spotted by the pilots themselves. Ground controllers, liaison officers equipped with radio sets attached to advancing American units, could call in immediate air support against German positions identified as blocking the advance. This close air support capability, coordinated between ground and air forces with unprecedented effectiveness, created synergy that multiplied the combat power of both services. American infantry encountering German defensive positions could request airstrikes against specific pillboxes, buildings, or tree lines. Within minutes, Thunderbolts would arrive overhead, mark the target through coordination with the ground controller, and attack with weapons appropriate to the target: rockets against hardened positions, bombs against buildings, machine gun fire against tree lines. Wehrmacht soldiers found this coordination particularly demoralizing. German doctrine assumed defensive positions would face ground assault that could be repelled through superior positioning, prepared fortifications, and coordinated defensive fires. Instead, American infantry would fix German positions with limited attacks, while calling in airstrikes that systematically destroyed the defensive positions. German soldiers who survived described watching American infantry withdraw to safe distance, followed moments later by aircraft diving on their positions with rockets and bombs. After the airstrike, American infantry would advance against positions reduced from organized resistance to scattered survivors. Gefreiter Otto Schwarz, captured during the Falaise Pocket Battle, described his experience to Allied interrogators. Our company occupied defensive positions along a stone wall. We had excellent fields of fire across the open ground the Amis would need to cross. We were confident we could hold until reinforcements arrived. The American infantry approached to perhaps 500 meters, then stopped. We prepared to engage. Instead, they pulled back. I saw the ground officer talking into his radio. Perhaps 3 minutes later, we heard aircraft engines. 4 Jabos came from the west at low altitude. They launched rockets, perhaps 20 rockets total. The wall was struck multiple times. 3 of our gun positions were destroyed outright. The remaining positions were suppressed. Then the aircraft strafed the length of the wall. When they departed, fewer than half our men were combat effective. The American infantry advanced immediately. We could offer only scattered resistance. The position was overrun within 10 minutes. This tactical integration of air and ground power represented doctrinal evolution that German forces struggled to counter. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination at tactical level. Infantry, armor, artillery, working together under unified command. But German doctrine had not evolved to incorporate air power as a routine element of combined arms tactics. The Luftwaffe operated as a separate service with separate command structure and separate tactical objectives. German ground commanders could request air support, but could not guarantee it would arrive when needed, in sufficient strength, against specific targets requiring immediate attention. American doctrine had evolved differently through experience in the Mediterranean theatre, where close air support had proven decisive at Anzio and Monte Cassino. By Normandy, the procedures were refined to operational art. Ground controllers knew exactly how to communicate target location. Pilots knew exactly what ground controllers needed. The radio frequencies were coordinated. The terminology was standardized. Most importantly, the aircraft were available in sufficient numbers that requests for air support were granted routinely rather than being rare exceptions. This availability stemmed directly from American industrial production that delivered aircraft faster than combat operations destroyed them. The production differential between American and German aircraft manufacturing demonstrated industrial asymmetry that shaped everything else. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale facility produced approximately 60 P-47s monthly by mid-1944. Curtiss-Wright's Buffalo plant added another 55 monthly. Combined production exceeded 115 aircraft monthly from just 2 factories building 1 fighter type. Meanwhile, Germany's entire aircraft industry produced approximately 25,000 aircraft of all types during 1944 fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft combined. The United States produced over 96,000 aircraft in 1944, with 38,000 fighters alone. This production asymmetry created strategic asymmetry that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. German pilots might shoot down multiple P-47s through superior tactics or positioning, but those aircraft would be replaced within days from production that seemed unlimited to German forces experiencing chronic shortages of everything. A German fighter shot down represented a training aircraft lost, a pilot lost, who required months to replace if replacement was possible at all, and a production slot lost that might not be replaced for weeks depending on which factory had been most recently bombed. The human cost of this attrition warfare fell disproportionately on German forces who could not sustain the losses. An American P-47 pilot shot down over France might evade capture and return to England through the resistance networks, or might become a prisoner of war and survive the conflict, or might be killed. But his squadron would receive a replacement pilot within days or weeks, a young man with 250 hours of flight training, adequate preparation for combat operations. A German fighter pilot shot down represented an irreplaceable loss by late 1944. Replacement pilots, if available at all, arrived with perhaps 50 hours total flight time, barely sufficient to take off and land safely, wholly insufficient for combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft in superior numbers. The psychological impact on surviving German pilots cannot be overstated. They understood through direct experience that they were fighting a losing battle against inevitable defeat. Every mission reduced the number of experienced pilots. Every mission meant confronting numerical odds of 5 or 10 to 1. Every mission required rationing ammunition, because replacements were uncertain. And every mission was flown with fuel that grew increasingly scarce as Allied bombing destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities. By September 1944, as Allied forces reached Germany's western frontier, the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but only how long defeat could be delayed. German ground forces had been systematically attrited during the fighting in France. Units that had entered Normandy at full strength emerged, if they emerged at all, as skeleton forces missing most of their equipment and men. The Panzer Division, an elite armoured formation that had entered combat in Normandy with over 200 tanks and over 14,000 men, emerged from the Falaise pocket with perhaps 30 tanks and 4,000 men. This was typical rather than exceptional. Wehrmacht soldiers who survived the Normandy campaign and the retreat across France carried understanding of modern warfare that differed fundamentally from what they had learned during training or experienced during earlier campaigns in Poland, France, or Russia. They understood that armoured vehicles, no matter how well designed or heavily armoured, were vulnerable to air attack. They understood that movement during daylight was suicidal under enemy air supremacy. They understood that defensive positions, however well prepared, could be destroyed systematically from the air. Most fundamentally, they understood that they were fighting an opponent who possessed resources so vastly superior to their own that defeat was inevitable, regardless of tactical skill or courage. This understanding permeated through German military culture in ways that affected combat effectiveness beyond direct physical losses from air attack. Units that expected to be attacked from the air operated cautiously, avoided concentrating forces, moved slowly, and prioritized concealment over aggressive maneuver. These were rational tactical responses to real threats, but they also meant German forces fought reactively rather than proactively, ceding initiative to opponents who exploited that initiative ruthlessly. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated both the persistence of traditional Wehrmacht tactical skill and the ultimate futility of operations under Allied air supremacy. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive recognized that winter weather might ground Allied aircraft, creating a window for German mobile operations without the crushing air superiority that had destroyed German offensives in Normandy. The initial German attacks on December 16th achieved surprise and made significant gains against American forces thinly spread in the Ardennes sector. For the first 4 days, heavy overcast weather grounded most Allied aircraft, allowing German armoured forces to advance rapidly. But on December 23rd, the weather cleared. The entire weight of Allied tactical air power fell upon the exposed German columns. 9th Air Force P-47s flew over 1,100 sorties on December 23rd alone, attacking every German vehicle column, supply depot, and defensive position they could locate. The attacks continued through Christmas and into the following week. German commanders pleaded for fuel deliveries to sustain their advance. Allied aircraft systematically destroyed the fuel convoys attempting to reach forward units. German armour literally ran out of fuel within sight of the Meuse River, their objective. Hundreds of vehicles were abandoned in place, their crews retreating on foot because no fuel existed to drive them and no recovery vehicles existed to tow them. Second Lieutenant James Bowes, flying P-47s with the 387th Fighter Squadron, described attacking German columns near Monschau, Germany. On December 17th, we spotted a column of vehicles and armour under the trees attempting concealment, perhaps 20 to 30 vehicles, including what looked like Tiger tanks based on their size. We attacked in trail formation, each aircraft diving separately to maintain continuous pressure. I fired 4 HVARs at a tank positioned at the column's head. Observed 2 hits, one on the turret, one on the hull. The tank erupted in flames immediately, shifted to a half-track beside the burning tank, expended remaining rockets, then strafed the column's length with all 8 guns. On my second pass, flak caught me 20mm shells, very accurate, took hits in the left wing and fuselage. Felt the impacts like someone hitting the aircraft with a hammer. But the jug kept flying, nursed it back to base with significant damage. Bowes' experience was typical. The P-47's durability enabled aggressive tactics against heavily defended targets. Pilots understood they might take hits, but trusted their aircraft to survive battle damage that would down other fighters. This tactical advantage multiplied effectiveness. Pilots who can press attacks without excessive caution achieve better results than pilots forced to break off early to avoid damage. The cumulative effect across hundreds of missions and thousands of sorties created destruction totals that seemed almost impossible to German commanders receiving reports from the field. By January 1945, the Bulge offensive had cost Germany approximately 800 tanks destroyed, over 1,000 other armoured vehicles eliminated, approximately 120,000 casualties, and critically, fuel reserves that could not be replaced. The offensive failed, not primarily from American ground resistance, though that resistance was stubborn and effective, but from systematic destruction of German mobility, logistics, and armoured forces by air attack. Wehrmacht operational doctrine required mobile warfare. Allied air supremacy made mobile warfare impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.